Hello, lepo pozdravljeni na tej ediciji Prevodnega Prangerja. Welcome to this edition of the so-called Translation Pranger Festival. And because we have eminent international interlocutors here, this conversation is going to take place in English. Doesn't really bother anyone. Now the thing is, the Translation Pranger is actually the younger sister, let's say, of the literary criticism and poetry Pranger. And as you know, every year there is a language selected, preferably a smaller language, which is in focus. So specimens of Slovene poets' works are translated into that language as well. And this year, it was Maltese. I'm very happy to be able to host here, first of all, Abigail Ardelle Zammit, who is a poet in her own right. She published her last book of poems now in 2025. Maybe Nina could show the picture. Yes, so leaves borrowed from human flesh. And she's also a lecturer at the Malta University, a highly acclaimed author, and she was kind enough to undertake this task of translating our poets, not directly from Slovene to Maltese, of course, because I don't think there are very many people who know both languages. But I actually prepared these intermediary English translations, and then, of course, it was possible to translate these English translations into Maltese. Then my second interlocutor is Professor Immanuelom Mifsudom, one of the most prominent names Maltese literary productions. I would say he's one of those members of the Generation X who were actually born after Malta gained its independence in 1964, and he's also very famous for his searing critical views of the Maltese society and the tensions within it. So he's, I think he actually began more in the theater circles, but then he also writes novels, short stories, lots of poetry, of course, also children's stories. And what's interesting is that he actually co-authored an anthology of post-independence Maltese literature in Slovene translations, and the other editor was Peter Semolič, whom I'm also greeting here. Yes, that's Vara Septembru. It means after September, because it was September when Malta declared its independence. And so Immanuel and Peter both collaborated on this selection of prose and poetry, which is considered in contemporary Maltese literature. And interestingly enough, Peter also translated several other of Immanuel's works. And now, this year, Peter was again selected as one of the Pranger poets. So now, at last, it wasn't just him who translated Maltese poets into Slovene, but now he also got his own translation into Maltese, a sort of poetic justice. Well, of course, I haven't said anything really exceptional about any of my interlocutors. All these facts are very well known. For example, Peter was present here at Pranger with his latest 16th collection, Žalostinke za okroglo zemljo, which means lamentations or dirges for around Earth. And now I was actually thinking, since Maltese is such an unusual language for Slovenes, I thought that maybe we might start by saying some things about the Maltese language as such, maybe a very short history of Malta, which is also reflected in the qualities of this language. So I thought we might start with a very short explanation by which nations Malta was colonized in its history and how this has impacted the local language use. And I think that people here would appreciate some information about Maltese. We read it's a Semitic language, Semitic, so not Indo-European, with many Romance admixtures. So I wonder, does it have the categories we are used to, such as declensions, conjugations? Slovenian, for example, is a highly inflected language. So, Immanuel, could you maybe out here?
Yes, very briefly, of course. The island was ruled by a very long list of rulers. Presumably, the first inhabitants came from Sicily, and we're talking about something like nearly 9,000 years ago. Although very recently, some archaeologists from our university made a very important discovery, which basically will lead to a rewriting of prehistory in this case. But to answer your question, the island was ruled by the Carthaginians, by the Phoenicians, eventually the Romans, and then there were a number of small settlements leading to the Arabic period, which was very important because it, of course, influenced our language thoroughly. And then after the Arabs, we had the succession of feudal lords under the Spanish, and then the island was basically it formed part of the kingdom of the two Sicilies, and then eventually the island was, so to speak, rented to the Order of Saint John, which is the longest period. Then for a very short time, barely 2 years, the French under Napoleon, of course, and then the British until 1964, from 1800 to 1964. Language-wise, of course, we say that it's a Semitic language, although it's written in Latin script. So it's unique in that sense because it's a Semitic language, but it uses the Latin script. But of course, there is a Romance superstructure to this Semitic structure. And when we say Romance, we mean by that Sicilian and Italian. But then, of course, due to the British colonization, we have very strong English influx in the language. I would say that the English influx came first from the colonial period, eventually after the war, and nowadays it comes especially from technology. So that would be an American type of English, so to speak, which is basically being used all over the world nowadays. So that was a very, very, very brief history of the island and how this reflects in our language.
Yes, thank you. I remember when I saw Maltese for the first time in a tourist guide or something. I remember that I was really struck by this because on the one hand it did seem a bit like Arabic or something, but on the other hand there were these very, very recognizable Italian, maybe even mixtures. Like there's one of these poems which were translated by Abigail. And this one's by Tanja Božić, a young poet called Tanja Božić, A Hazelnut in the Dark. And then it begins with a reference to an alarm clock. Budilka in Slovene, so it's an alarm clock. And what I see here on the Maltese side is Izveljarin. And this reminds me of Izvelja, of course. And then, of course, then there's also Intrata, and was like that. So really, really, the language is peppered with these romance elements. So now there are two official languages in Malta, right? One of them is Maltese, which was a bit late in gaining prominence because it was mostly limited to maybe the more rural classes, whereas at first Italian was the most prominent language for quite a while. Yes, of course, after, as far as I remember reading, after the Maltese called in the British to help them against the French, of course, the result was that they ended up under the British, and that's why this bilingualism of the Maltese population. So both languages are actually taught at school. So the population, like you two, for example, is bilingual, but the preferred language of high is English. Now, I was wondering about both of you. Abigail, for example, writes in English. Immanuel writes in Maltese. And could both of you explain what led you to adopt these languages as your means of poetic expression? And also, what are the connotations of the use of either language? Is it also a matter of prestige, of pride? I don't know. So maybe Abby, you can start.
Yes. In my case, I can't recall a time when I was not bilingual. So when I went to school, I was not taught English there or Maltese there. I already knew both languages. So I think my parents, especially my mother, made an effort to speak both languages. And I do remember that growing up, there was a stage where it was a little bit difficult because I was 7 years old and the other classmates, I used to go to a Catholic school, but it was the only Catholic school in Malta where we were not obliged to speak English. I think that's important because some of them imposed English. And they were saying Abigail is the English girl, which I absolutely detested. So I went home and I told my mom, it's useless for you to speak to me in English because I won't answer you in English. And she said, we'll see. And I said, well, we'll see. But I never spoke to her in English again. I always answered her English questions in Maltese. So that I think it tells you a lot about children and the pressures from society depending on the majority language, right? But of course, I liked all languages really, and I studied both Maltese and English at advanced level. But then at university, I chose English and Italian. And I think I've read more literature in English than literature in Maltese, though I must say I love both language. And I really feel it's a shame that in some cases there are Maltese people, in fact, especially younger people now, who don't know how to speak Maltese properly, right? The situation has changed also because of American programs, American TV, right, and changes in population. But Immanuel can talk more about that. My choice of English, of course, the choice of the language in which you write is always a political choice. But in my case, it's more of an instinctive choice, although I cannot run away from the political repercussions of it. So I must say that inspiration mostly comes to me in English, right? And perhaps that is because I follow a particular music. Sonics and soundscape is very important for me. So if I'm reading a lot of English, although I speak Maltese a lot, but if I'm reading a lot of English, then of course those kinds of rhythms will inhabit my body, I think, and that's why it comes out as English. My very first poem when I was a child was in Maltese, because I remember being influenced by Mary Mela, who was a Gozitan poet, and I loved her nature poetry. But after that, funnily enough, I immediately switched to English. So for me, it's an instinctive choice. And I must say, on the other hand, that it has its advantages too, because English no longer belongs to the British, of course, or to its native speakers. It's an international language. And if you can infiltrate the language that way, right, as a post-colonized writer, then you can change it much more effectively. So that is another type of political action, right? In a situation where Maltese were being threatened, then, of course, I would have to rethink my position. For the moment, I feel I'm all right this way, but it doesn't mean that I won't write in Maltese in the future, because if I'm inspired to write in Maltese, I'd be very happy to do so. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. And Immanuel, what about you? Your choice to use Maltese?
So let's put it this way. Until recently, the social situation in Malta was, when it comes to language use, English was spoken by a certain class, and Maltese was spoken by the vast majority of the Maltese population. I wanted to clarify something about the official languages of Malta. The constitution stipulates that Maltese is the national language, and Maltese and English are the two official languages. So there's a bit of there's the national language and the official languages. And actually, we say that there is another language which is also national, which is the Maltese language, the Maltese Sign Language. At university where I teach, we are very adamant on bringing up this point, that there is a Maltese Sign Language which we consider as yet another official language. So that was just a bracket about this thing. So I was saying that when I was a child, Maltese and English, the use of these two languages had social markings. And I came from the south of the island, because you'd be surprised, despite the smallness of the island, there used to be, let's put it this way, a clear demarcation between the southern part of the island and the northern part of the island. And in the south, there was the concentration of the working class. People who worked at the dockyards, people who worked in factories, and this type of jobs. And my family was very working class. My parents were practically illiterate or only semi-literate, and at home we only spoke Maltese. We never used English. So for me, English was the language you learn at school, but you don't use at home and you don't use in your everyday life. And I believe that was why I chose, or I was led to write in Maltese. It was in my case, it was not a political choice, but it was purely instinctive. That basically I was brought up with this idea in mind that my language or my class's language is Maltese, and English is something you learn at school and you use at school or you use in formal situations, but not in everyday life. And that led me to write Maltese eventually.
Thank you. So Maltese as a literary language, as a language of literature, actually only became prominent in the late 19th century or something, as far as I remember. Although the first text does date back to the 15th century, Il Cantilena, I think
Yes.
it's called. And that's sort of interesting too, because when we think about these books or events that shape languages, that sort of make language a fully fledged language in many cases. That was the translation of the Bible. The same thing in Slovene, the translation of the Bible or other theological texts. Once that was accomplished, somehow the language got so built up in the process that it really began to show its grammatical, syntactic, and so on characteristics. And of course, also for English, those Bible translations were very important and all that. But in Malta, apparently things went differently. So this wasn't really such a big issue. The translation of, let's say, the Bible into Maltese.
There was a bit of an issue really when it came to the New Testament, because one of our foremost intellectuals, Michelangelo Vassalli, who was the first one, he studied he studied in Rome, and he wrote one of the first grammars of Maltese. But the thing which strikes most in this grammar was actually not the grammar itself, but the declaration he made in the foreword to the grammar, where basically he addressed the country as the Maltese nation, which was unheard of when Malta was still under the Knights of St. John. He eventually was asked to translate the New Testament when we were already under the British, but he was asked to do so by some Protestant group, and the Catholic Church in Malta, of course, was objected to that, because the Catholic Church was always very much concerned that the British rule would eventually lead to a takeover by the Church of England. So there was continuous, which was also it found this issue about Catholicism and Protestant religion featured also in the political side, which eventually led to the independence, because for a time the Maltese government at that time first was thinking of not independence but of integration with Great Britain. The Catholic Church was very, very much against that for religious reasons, with this concern of the Church of England, and also that the head of the island would be the head of the Protestant church, so they couldn't really accept it. But anyway, that was another issue which we won't go into it. Actually, I'm talking too much and I lost exactly what the question was. Yes, the Bible. Nowadays, we use two versions of the Bible. One was translated from the original languages, both versions. One was translated by this eminent theologian, Peter Saidon, and we call it Biblia Saidon. And then there is the other version, which uses a different type of Maltese, less poetical, maybe I would say even less archaic in certain parts, there's a special commission which works within the Curia that takes their intent and their role is to update the translation of the Bible. So we're talking about translations happening already in the 20th century. Keep in mind that until the 1930s, Maltese was not considered to be a language, and it didn't even have an established alphabet. For a time, there were different alphabets for the language, and then it was standardized in the 1930s, which is basically yesterday.
Because Maltese characters do have these lots of these diacritic signs, right? Like for example, H, which is crossed out, or Karens, and all kinds of little things that must affect the pronunciation.
Yes.
Now, if we look at Maltese, obviously it is the national language, but of course there is this rival in the form of this Americanization and so on, which is going on all the time, and of course British English. And I was wondering, what are the governmental measures to foster Maltese? For example, extra subsidies for Maltese writing authors, because there is something called the Arts Council, right? Also, some of our translations here, which were done by Peter into Slovene, I see were subsidized by the Arts Council. So that's one measure, right? For promoting the use of the Maltese language, of its development. So how does this look? For example, you want to write a book in Maltese, apply to council, and then you get this grant, or
I don't know. Maybe Abigail wants to.
I'll let you answer, Immanuel, because since I write in English, it doesn't much apply to me, really.
Yes, in fact, but Abigail, I think, will say something about this eventually. With books written by Maltese but published abroad, I know, Abigail, you have this issue, which of course I think you should discuss it with us. As it happens, if we consider the number of writers there are at the moment, there is only a very small group of us who write in English. Abigail, of course, is one of them, and there are only a few others. When it comes to funding, actually, what funding is only given for either for translation of foreign works into Maltese, or the other way around, of Maltese works into some foreign language. And then there's another fund for books which might not interest the publishers, but the council deemed them to be very publishable books. Also, the Arts Council is no longer responsible for funding books. Now there is the Book Council, which has taken over this section of publishing in Malta. So that's how it is. So each year there are these funds. If I am not mistaken, the most popular tier is the one of having Maltese literature to be translated into foreign languages, and there's a and nowadays I think this was one of the effects of joining the European Union. This is my theory, that the interest in Maltese language and in Maltese literature somehow grew. I mean, until a few years before joining the EU, you would hardly have Maltese books translated into another language. Only very few writers, like Oliver Frigieri, he had a number of books translated into different languages, but Oliver Frigieri was an exception in that sense. Nowadays it's very different. But I know that Abigail has something to say about this, and I think it's also important to raise this point.
Well, thank you, Manuel. To be honest, I was going to avoid it because it's a knotty issue.
Right.
But since you mentioned it, I'll speak about it very briefly. Basically, there used to be a category for English, and you can still submit books to the National Book Prize in other languages, right? And I had won it in 2007 with my first book. But when it came to submitting my second book, I realized that the rules have changed. If the book had a foreign ISBN number, you could no longer participate. And that means that I've been excluded from participating. Which I'm not happy about, particularly because it seems to give me the message that I am not Maltese and I'm not proud to be Maltese. And I'm sure that that's not what my writing says all along, right? So I'll stop here because I think I've said enough, but a lot of Maltese writers are not even aware of the situation I'm in because I haven't spoke about it publicly. This is the first time I am actually, because I don't want to draw too much attention to it. In any case, I have very good reasons for publishing abroad. And it's not only about readership. If you are going to communicate with publishers and editors that have a lot of exposure in the English language, they're going to give you better feedback. And if my poetry is not good enough, then they will not publish it. So it's as simple as that. I impose very strict measures on myself, and I don't want my work to be published if it's not yet ready. Obviously, if you come from a small country in which most people are writing in Maltese, then the exposure of publishers and editors will be obviously less, even though I have every respect for them. But I prefer it the other way around, right? So I prefer to set these kinds of yardsticks. And there's another thing also, people might not be aware of it, but if you publish a book with a particular publisher, then you can't resubmit it to be published by another one, right? That's mostly an impossibility, whether we're talking of the United States or Canada or the UK or Australia, right? It's just not profitable because poetry is not profitable. Publishers don't make money from poetry, basically. Yes. Perhaps I'm moving into your next point. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, because I was actually going to ask how a budding, an aspiring young Maltese poet goes about, securing a place in this literary system. Are there any, for example, any Maltese publishing houses that specialize in poetry? For example, in Slovenia, we do have several publishing houses that really specialize in poetry. How easy or how difficult is it to get recognition when you're at the beginning of your way?
It used to be much more difficult until recently. I remember, when I started to write, basically you started by printing your own books, for example. So it was a bit of a vanity thing. Publishers were not interested in new writers for the very simple reason they were afraid that they won't sell. And this held also for prose, not just for poetry. So a new writer had to dish out his or her money to have the book printed. Then eventually, if the first 2-3 books somehow are successful, then you would have a publisher interested in your work. Nowadays, it's different. In fact, there are publishers who publish budding writers. It holds more for prose than for poetry for very obvious reasons. But even young poets can find or can have the chance to be published. Now, having said that, I think it's very true that poetry does not sell, and this is a phenomenon which is not our phenomenon, but it's basically, I would think, all over the world. I never quite understood why, when you consider the contradiction then, that the number of poetry festivals is enormous, but then when it comes to selling the poetry books, things get very different then. And there's this phenomenon of people who go to poetry readings, who go to poetry festivals, but then they don't buy the books for some reason. And I never quite understood this phenomenon. But there are no, as far as I know, let's put it this way, as far as I know, there are no publishing houses in Malta specializing in publishing poetry. No, there's no such thing.
I just wanted to add a little point. I like traveling to Latin America, to South America, and sometimes I really envy them because I realize that they revere poets and they love poetry much more than anywhere else in the world. For example, in Argentina, in Chile, right? So I think it's because their poetry has a socio-political force that is lacking in Europe. We're almost scared of political poetry. And of course, I don't want poetry to be propaganda either. But there is some very good politically involved poetry. And there's also a second factor in answer to Immanuel's question. I think people don't buy poetry books because they're scared that they won't understand poetry. I've got this problem with my students all the time. Just to a little correction, I don't teach at the University of Malta. I teach at a junior college, which belongs to the University of Malta. So students are younger. And they've been taught all along that there's a secret meaning to the poem that they must decode. I don't blame teachers for having to adopt this method because the syllabus gears you towards it. But it creates this false impression that poetry has a specific mathematical meaning that only a person in a position of power and authority can decode. And they are not allowing themselves to be visited by the poem, to experience it as music or art. And therefore, it's creating this kind of resistance to it because the first thing they say is, oh, I won't be able to understand it. And then, of course, they won't buy poetry books. So it's up to us to create a culture, I think, where people can accept poetry more by changing preconceptions about it. But I do believe it's very difficult. I try as much as I can in my contact with younger people, but it's still difficult.
What Abigail is saying, in fact, it's reminding me of this anecdote I was in Cork in Ireland, and there was Thomas Shalamoon in that festival. And one day we were having breakfast together in this little restaurant, and Thomas used to go there quite early and write poetry in this cafe, whatever, restaurant. And one day we were together having a coffee, and the waiter comes along, and he asked him, by any chance, are you a poet? And Tomasz said, yes, I am Tomasz Sharon from Slovenia, and this one is from Malta, etc., etc. And the waiter asked him, so tell me, how many books of your poems do you sell? And Tomasz laughed and he said, well, I have no idea, but not many. And the waiter told him, I write poetry and I sell 5 copies a week. And Tomasz said, oh, so tell me what the secret is. And this young Irish poet who was doing work as a waiter told him, because my poetry is not difficult. And my poetry communicates. And when he left, Tomasz told me, this guy has taught me a lesson. Unfortunately, Tomasz passed away shortly afterwards. But you know what I mean? This is what basically it is in agreement to what Abigail is saying. Sometimes poetry has become so, I don't know, that it scares people. It's true. Yes, it does not communicate, and it scares people. I don't know.
And also this idea that you have to get just the right interpretation because it's what's expected of you at exams, stuff like that. So people don't even try to really think about it. They just try to I don't know, predict somehow what might be expected to say of them at this particular moment when they're asked to analyze a poem or something. So yeah, that really is a problem. But the reason, for example, why I became interested in this Pranger festival was exactly that, you know, there are so many different modern poetics. It's not just a sort of pattern that people follow. It's everybody has a completely different poetic, and I really wanted to see what others had to say about it, what others saw in these poetics, and it's interesting that sometimes totally conflicting analyses will appear. But it's interesting. I mean, I think it should be more. It should be encouraged at school as well. This right to say what you mean, and not just to memorize something and regurgitate it.
Yeah, if I may add something, I think, you know, because I mentioned the poetry festivals and the public readings, and sometimes, you know, the poets themselves ruin their own poetry because they can't read well, you know, they can't recite.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I think this should be you know, the job of actors and what have you to transmit the poetry, because sometimes you hear people telling you, listen, I don't like poetry, but I heard so and so reading this poem and I was really touched. And then you'd realize that sometimes poets have no idea. They might be even the greatest poets ever, but they have no idea how to communicate and how to transmit they ruin their own work, you know, because they can't read well, you know what I mean. They can't recite a poem, and we all know that poetry is something which, you know, you listen to, you hear the different intonations, as Abigail was saying, the rhythm, the music, etc. And poets, they can write it, but many of them, they can't read it. And that is also another problem, I would say.
Well,
Yes, that's
just
true.
to add a little point, I really feel that poetry has to be experienced rather than understood. Understanding comes afterwards. It requires a lot of patience, and this is not a world where people have the time for it. So that's perhaps what we have to teach to some extent. I'm not totally in agreement with Immanuel about simplifying poetry, because labeling poetry difficult can also be dangerous in some ways. I prefer allowing a lot of different poetries to coexist. But for starters, I think it's good to allow students or listeners at a festival to start with something that is very accessible. Once you gain their trust, then of course you can present other types of poetry. But I think we all agree that if you're at a festival and you don't have the actual text in front of you, it's very difficult to follow a poem that is intellectually challenging. So it's also a matter of choice. And I agree with him. Some poets are very good readers of the work. Some others are terrible readers of the work, and in fact, they hate reading it. I have encountered situations, however, where there are actors and they overdo the acting or the tone or the voice. So that is something that we might want to pay attention to also, just to present some variation within what he said, although I mainly agree with him.
And speaking of this musical quality, of this sound quality, I wanted to ask Nina to play us your recording of your translation of Peter's poem, actually the first poem, which appears in the in this Žalostinke za okroglo zemljo, in this collection, because you were also very particular. You were very curious about how it sounded in Slovene, so I actually had to record a reading in Slovene and mail it to you. And then I thought, of course, we can't possibly imagine what it really sounds in Maltese, how it really sounds in Maltese, and that's why I asked you to record the Maltese readings, because it's only so that we can actually get a glimpse into this huge system of the language, of its sonority. So if Nina could play us this recording, that would be great.
Peter Semolič. Qabel nibda. Il-qattusa tintelaq fuq l-adba bejn l-intrata u l-istudju. Skrivanija ċkejkna fejn terħi riġleja u fuq riġleja rasa. Titniet għax ħajjet il-tati sibsa u kol. Tiflini fiss. Niftakar f'xena minn Betty Blue. Is-sess għatma kien egżini u ħerqan. L-imħabba għatma natat daqstan tal-pjaċir. It-tfajla ma dixmana. Il-ġuvni poġġi qudiem it-typewriter. Fuq l-iskrivanija hemm qattusa li ssaqsi bleħen il-mara mejta. Qed tikteb jerfa' jnejh u jlissen qed naħseb.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I must say, so Peter, how does it feel to hear your own poetry in this guise?
In Maltese. Well, it sounds wonderful, much better than in Slovene, I think.
I love translating your poetry, Peter. First of all, because it was the only poem that had a bit of a sense of humor to it. It was lighthearted, but at the same time, it also talks about poetry itself. You know what? I didn't know the film Betty Blue, and I watched all of it in order to make sure I was translating it right. And I'm glad I watched the film. I really enjoyed it. And of course, the woman in the film could also be an allegorical figure or a representation of inspiration. So that's why she threatens to destroy the writer all the time until he actually muffles her voice and he actually kills her. So I found that really, really interesting, and the way you brought it in very gradually. But one thing I wanted to say, since we're talking about translation and you asked me about gendered words. So in Maltese, we have gendered nouns, right? And the verbs also can show up the gender. So that's why I chose atusa, which means female cat, rather than atus, which is a male cat, because of course that cat represents a female character there. And I thought it also lent it some more tenderness, and I thought the Maltese sounded more soulful that way within the poem. So I really enjoyed that process.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So I've been wondering, how exactly did you hit on the idea of Peter of translating Maltese literature? I mean, what was the trigger? Was it some sort of festival you attended, or some people you met, or?
No, it was years and years ago. Brane Senegačnik, Slovenian poet and translator, and he was the last chief editor of Nova Revija. Nova Revija was a very famous Slovenian literary magazine, especially famous in 80s and 90s. Now it don't exist anymore. So he asked me to translate some poems for magazine of one Maltese author, Immanuelom Mifsudom. And I think that he gave me some poems, and I read these poems, and I like them very much. And then I asked for help Vera Pejović. She is a poet and translator, and we translate together for 30 years now, I think. And we started to translate first for Nova Revija, a bunch of poems, I don't know, 10, 15 poems, something like this. And then we translated the first book, and then we started to translate Jutta Heim. So we translated poetry and prose of Immanuel. So that's how we started.
And of course, you couldn't translate it directly, right? From the original, you had to go via English.
Yeah.
So who was the translator? Was it Immanuel himself, or were there other intermediary translators? There's somebody called Adriano Gatto, I think, who's often mentioned.
The poems Peter is talking about, which eventually were in Nova Revija, then eventually were part of the I won't manage to say the title in Slovene, the handful of leaves.
Yeah.
And eventually the other collection of Riba, no? Those were translated by one of our eminent female poets who started writing in English and then switched to Maltese. Well, she writes in both languages, Maria Greganado, and she translated those poems, which eventually Peter then translated into Maltese. Nowadays, I have another friend of mine who actually she's American, not English, and she translate. We basically translate together. Because I am very, American translators are different from Europeans. They tend to, to be more free in the way they translate. input is much more personal than, Europeans try to stick to the original as much as possible. The Americans have a different idea. And so sometimes we discuss and we quarrel a lot about the choice of even one word. And Peter, if you remember, we met for the first time in that festival happening in February. That's when we got to know each other, no?
Yeah, and then I gave the translations of Immanuel's poems to Tomasz Koryan. It's also a poet. And he was a director of one very nice festival in Ljubljana, the festival called Trnovski terceti. He liked Immanuel's poems too, and so he invited him to Ljubljana. So that was the first time we met each other. And then I visited Malta. I was invited to their festival there, and then you came for Vilenica, I think, in Slovenia.
No, before Vilenica, there was some other festival of something which has to do with water, I think. And
I remember. I don't remember the name of festival, but yes. Yeah.
And then Vilenica eventually. Yeah.
Then Vilenica, yes. And the translating, if maybe this will be interesting. It's for me. I don't like to translate from the third language, because I feel very insecure. I don't know the original, and I don't have access to the original. But in the case of Maltese authors, Immanuel and later Antoine Cassar, this is not such a big problem because they have very, very good translations into English. And besides this, we are very, Vera and I, we constantly ask authors, about the text. And so we were in contact with Immanuel all the time, and he helped us a lot. When we weren't sure what was going on in the text, he was there and he translated, for example, word by word, and we discussed about some parts of the text and so on. So, it was a great experience, and I really enjoyed to translate his work.
Yes, I think it's very important that there is a lot of interaction between author and translator, because otherwise, if you see an intermediary translation, you can never know just how much you are allowed to depart from it. You don't know if you might discover there's something that you really blow up out of proportion, and actually the author never meant such a thing. So it's really very important to have access to this first-hand source. Now, I was wondering about translations. Abigail, you do not often translate into Maltese from English, right? But the other way around. So this wasn't this wasn't like your first translation of an English text into Maltese, but there haven't been so many. And I would like to ask you, how do you feel about it?
Yeah, it was a relatively new experience. I usually translate the work of Joella Gallia, who is a very well-established Maltese poet, and I translated from Maltese to English. And as Immanuel and Peter have been saying, it's easier that way and less frustrating. I definitely agree, because when you're translating a poet who already knows the language in which his work is being translated or her work is being translated, then of course you can communicate more effectively in cases of any kinds of ambiguity, all the connotations of words, sounds, right? So you can develop a much stronger working relationship, and it becomes more collaborative. So what I usually do with Joella Gallia's work is, first I translate it, but I leave a lot of possibilities in brackets. I have not yet decided on some of the words to choose, right? And I send him that version, and then I go to his house and we meet and we spend hours there deciding on it. But as in your case, the first thing I want is for me to listen to the actual words on the page, the actual poem. I can't overstress this. For me, poetry is firstly music, then meaning, in that order. So I don't agree with linguists that there is no connection between the word and its sound. And that's why I asked you to send recordings of the 6 poets I was translating, because I want to allow the poet to get under my skin and for the poem to inhabit me. I use that word because I do believe very much in this kind of embodiment, right? And for the poem to inhabit me, I have to visit it, not the other way around. I do not have authority. The poem itself has authority, not even its writer, but the poem itself. And therefore, if I'm open to it, then I can listen to its music first and foremost. Right? So obviously it's easier in Maltese because I know the language, I can read the poems, although I still ask Joella Gallia to read them for me. But in your case, that's what I did. There were some situations where I was still a little bit frustrated. Of course, your translations are brilliant, but I was asking myself, can this word be widened? And I started looking up words with Google Translate because I don't know any Slovenian. And I was also paying a lot of attention to when the word is actually repeated. I was looking at the Slovenian version to see whether the English tallies with the Slovenian version. So there is a poem, The Light of the Snow Moon, for example, right? Lucia Stupica, a beautiful poem. And to get it right, I wanted to make sure the repetition was there. And there are many types of repetition. The repetition of single sounds, be they vowels or consonants, the repetitions of syllables. Most of this poetry wasn't rhymed, and the repetition of words. Now, with words, I managed to repeat preparations and rain in Maltese. For the others, I found alternatives because they seemed better. But of course, you can't repeat phonetics because a language carries its own sound with it. So the thing is, if you listen to the poem, then you can allow yourself to find alternative sounds. So, for example, if there is the alliteration of the z sound, as it was the case in one of the poems, then in Maltese, I try to find another sound that lends itself to the creation of the same tone. I believe that tone is very important and mood is very important. If you don't translate those well, you failed at translating the poetry, right? Even more than literal meaning, although of course literal meaning is important. And I agree with Manuel that it's important, in my opinion, not to depart too much from the meaning of the original. But in some cases, if you're translating a metaphor, very often you can't use the same terms, right? So you have to create another metaphor. So what is similar between translating from Maltese and translating from Slovenian using an intermediary, that in both cases and whatever translation you do, you are recreating the work. Translation is a work of reimagining and recreation. It is not tedious. It's in fact very, very creative. The only difference is that you know where the poem is going in terms of the meaning at the end, where it's going to get to, right? You know the tone and the mood with which it's going to end up, but you don't know the musical score you're going to use in order to reach that particular end, right? And that's how you have to experiment. So in some cases, my frustration, to go back to that, was that I realized that some words had more than one possible interpretation, and that perhaps English was limiting you because, of course, each language has its limitations, right? And there were cases where I felt that Maltese opened it up better than English, and I was hoping that its it approximates the Slovenian version, although of course I can't tell, I can't judge. And there were cases, of course, where the Maltese would be slightly more limited. Like, I think we loved over that the poem "The Light of the Snow Moon," because I told you the light of the snow moon could refer to the February moon, right? And that's not something we have in Malta either, in the sense that it doesn't snow here. And as Immanuel will confirm, we don't have many words for snow, simply because we don't see it around us. So silge, bora, just a few, you know. So in the end, I translated it with that in mind, but there is no reference for what the poet actually meant as a February moon. I just said, "Thou will amar silch," I think, which is effective enough, I think, as a metaphor, right? So yeah, that's. I can talk more in detail about any poem you want to ask me about, but I think that.
Yes, I agree with you very much, because I remember that once I was translating a poem by a Slovene poet. It was a children's poem, actually, into English. Now the whole that was Tone Pauček, and the whole point of that poem was that it rested on pseudo etymologies. So, okay, this word is contained within this word, and so on. But actually, they weren't real etymologies. So that was really. I mean, obviously, you couldn't observe the meaning, because the meaning was sort of secondary anyway. But you had to come up with totally innovative pairs of words. So at the end, you were sort of wondering, is this actually still a translation, or is it basically a new poem, which just sort of follows these basic guidelines, and is actually an original work. So yeah, it can be very, very very demanding and highly creative work. So I mean, it's not at all like, just going word for word. Okay, that means this. This means this. There were some problems also with some of these Slovene poems, not with Peter's, I must say, but with some others, because there
Tanja
was this.
Božić, right? If I'm pronouncing her name right, Tanja Božić.
Yeah, Božić.
Yes, Božić. Excuse me. So yes, you first handed me a poem that was called Oak, and
yes.
it was based on anagrams, right? And you sent me two versions. So you were, I really appreciated your effort, because you had to send me the literal version where you explained that in your language. Am I pronouncing them well? Hrast and stra, is that it?
Yes, exactly.
So oak and fear are anagrams of each other, you said, but you couldn't find the equivalent for them, the perfect equivalence for them in English, of course, and you had to make up others like oak, oxen, acorn, and horn. But then this problem came up, because I said, whereas there is a metaphysical connection, or even a spiritual connection between oaks and fear that works beautifully in the original, in the English version, that connection is utterly lost, right? There is no real link between oak and oxen, or acorn and horn. And I said, I've been looking for Maltese words, and I could come up with something totally different, but it would not be a translation. It would be a totally different poem in that case, because we're using 4 keywords that are totally different from the original meaning. So you sent me another poem that wasn't made up of wordplay, still a lovely poem, but we had to put that one aside in order to be a bit more faithful. So there we, that's the untranslatable there. I do believe that few texts are untranslatable.
Because I really cudgeled my brains. I mean, I looked at lists of tree names in English, and anything that might look like a tree, and then anything with the same letters that might call to mind something like fear or anxiety or something like that, and there just wasn't anything. It was incredible. There just wasn't anything. So yes, we have to.
It was also difficult in Maltese, although I had found something interesting, but it would have been too different.
Yes, it would have been totally different. And maybe it would have looked more like a, like an exercise in some sort of witticism, rather than something that can actually be felt and experienced to a deeper level. Because if you just have some nonsensical pair of words, even if there are anagrams, they can easily be. It can be banalized. This whole thing can be just made too trivial. So yeah, we had to drop that one. But there are also other interesting things. Yeah, there was something I wanted to ask all of you as poets. What about the original form in the sense of meter and rhyme? Now, in these poems here, there were no real rhymes, meter, or meters, stuff like that. But for example, have you ever written such a poem, or in translating, have you ever come across such a poem that really that was maybe older and as such adhered to certain formal characteristics which are not really so popular anymore nowadays?
I will let Peter or Manuel first. Yeah.
No, go ahead, Abigail. Go ahead.
No. I'll give you this one.
No, I was going to say, by choice, at one point, I made a choice to write what we call the hendecasyllabic line. That is the 11 syllables per line. In our language, but it's not just in ours, the 11 syllabic line is considered to be the classic poetry line, because in Maltese we don't speak of feet, but of the number of syllables. But I'm not the only one from the contemporary poets who chose to use the 11 syllable line. I mean, there are other poets who, for example, Norbert Bugeja uses it very, very, very strictly. He always writes his poems are always in the hendecasyllabic line as well. In my case, to be very honest with you, at one point I said, when I was still quite young, I said I want to do something which makes my poetry maybe stand out, because at my time, like many of us were writing in free verse, so that was really the trend back then. The problem nowadays is I can't get rid of the hendecasyllabic line. I find myself always writing in it, and I'm trying to change that. And I'm finding it extremely difficult because our national poet, who used to write in very strict meter, using different lines, but mostly 11 and 8 syllables a line. He used to say that he trained himself so much in using this that he used to catch himself even when he talked. He spoke in 11 lines, in 11 syllables. And I sometimes do catch myself doing that as well, And I would tell you something, and then I realized, okay, that sentence was an 11 syllable sentence, And I'm trying very hard to change this because it's becoming, not boring, but it's becoming too much of the usual thing somehow. I don't know how to explain myself. But it really becomes almost a physical thing, really, you know. When it comes. I know that there are. Peter mentioned Antoine Cassar. Antoine Cassar, he wrote his PhD on the sonnet, the Spanish sonnet, and he also wrote a number of sonnets. One of my friends, another poet, Adrian Grima, who was in Slovenia a few months ago, if I'm not mistaken, he published a book of limericks, which he wrote during the COVID lockdown. In fact, many of them have the COVID as the current theme. So some of us are revisiting these old forms, of course, giving them a very contemporary expression, but you know, visiting old forms, I would say, for various reasons. Maybe nostalgia might be one of them. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong in this. So yeah.
Abigail?
Yes, I totally understand what Immanuel is saying, because once there's an embodiment in a particular meter, it's very difficult to get rid of it. And one way actually of trying other forms is by reading a lot of poetry. For example, if you read a lot of poetry written in dactylic meter, right, which goes ta 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 ta. And if you listen to it a lot, then it will be easier to change that kind of. In English, two things. So in English, the endecasyllable is not the same as it is in Maltese. It's a very old form. It's a Latin form. And really, what it is a feet made up of two syllables, another one made up of three, and another two made up of two. So it becomes even more complicated, much more difficult. So it's not used a lot in the English language in that form. It's easier if it's just with 11 syllables, but that's not how we translate into English. But instead, a lot of English poets and English-speaking poets use iambs, the iambic pentameter. And to be honest with you, I'm a bit tired with it. I come from a school of thought, a rather feminist school of thought, which thinks that the iambic pentameter is also associated with our patriarchal inheritance, right? And although people believe that the sonnet should be in iambic pentameter, that is not true, right? It can actually be in other meters. There are other rules for the sonnet having to do with the rhyme scheme, with the volta, with the 14 lines, but it doesn't have to be that way. And I don't know many poets that are experimenting a lot with meter in this way. But although I started as a free verse poet, I always felt, to be honest with you, that there was something missing if I couldn't master meter. Of course, I knew how to analyze it, but to write in meter is a totally different story. So I've been practicing a lot in the last years. In my last collection, there are poems, for example, in dactylic hexameter, and in other forms like trochees. And I also break up those forms then with erasures and so on and so forth, right? But when translating, although I've never translated a text that is in meter or in a particular form, my first instinct would be to try to translate that form either in one that matches it accurately or one that's similar. So, for example, as far as I know, a lot of Russian literature is written in a specific kind of meter, which is called amphibrachic, right? It goes ta-ta-ta-ta-ta. And that's really difficult to write in English, but it's possible. And people just don't use it because they don't have enough practice. So I think it's wrong to try free verse straight away when you're translating. I think you should attempt meter first. See whether it sounds artificial. If it's too much, if it sounds fake or not true to the poem, then yes, move to free verse or to another form. But I think you should attempt to be faithful to it to start with.
Yes, the amphibrach is quite typical of Slovene as well. I think it has to do with with the structure of the language itself, because in Slovene, for example, we often begin a sentence or whatever with an unstressed syllable, and then these three syllables which come very naturally because we have all those inflections. So for example, even if you have like the shortest possible adjective like lep, which means beautiful, the genitive case would be lepega, and here we have two short, two unstressed syllables. So for example, in Slovene there is this very well known poem about Urška and the merman or the riverman, which begins od nekdaj lepe so Ljubljanke slovele, and so on. And that's really a very congenial meter to the Slovene language. Whereas, of course, the IM probably is very congenial to English, I suppose, because there's just so much of English poetry written in the iambic pentameter.
Well, a lot of feminist writers believe that this is not a lot, but a few feminist writers believe this is not the case. This is just like what we think is natural, but we're just not experimenting with the other forms, because the other forms are possible. And what you said just sounded beautiful, really. I can hear the rhythm very clearly, the rhythm of the empty bracket.
So, Peter, what about you? Have you ever tried your hand at metrical rhymes?
Yes, and my experience is quite similar to the experience of Immanuel. I wrote one book, it was Prostor zate, A Place for You, in different metrical schemes, you know. So, and somewhere almost when I finished the book, I noticed that I started to talk in meter, and I started to listen people who were talking to me and try to find a meter there. And it was quite annoying for me if they, and of course they don't speak in meter, you know, they didn't speak in meter. So so it was really annoying, and I stopped to write this way. And I returned to free verse. And I really like free verse. I really like it. Because you have a lot of different things, you know, other things to do with language. For example, in this book, not this poem. This poem is just opening poem. It's quite simple. Later on, there are poems. I don't know if can be translated into for example, English, because of I used a lot of etymology in the poems. So so maybe
that's death for the translator. Well, thank you. So maybe I just thought I might conclude by, you know, since we were talking now about these more inventive or less classical forms. Abigail, for example, you have very different, diverse forms in this new collection of yours. Okay, what I have singled out here is some of the poems are really very, you know, very traditional. For example, if you look at this, and interestingly, this particular poem, "Death by Water," was actually also selected for the Vara Settembru anthology. So actually, it was published in book form in Slovene long before it was published in book form in the original. but I also considered such things as, okay,
yes.
now this of course is more taxing, more demanding, I must say, for the reader, or let's say, okay,
Yes.
joined like this, right? Or here, this last section, leaves borrowed from human flesh, where we have these blackout erasures, apparently all of them based on Ovid's Metamorphoses.
That's, yeah, Heshwi or Daphne, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I thought that was that was interesting, this experimentation.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I see the page as a canvas, increasingly so. And because we've been talking about how most people are not interested in poetry, I've been thinking a lot of my readers and of presenting different ways of entering the text and communicating with the text. So in some cases, perhaps you did not show it, there are concrete poems like the one that is circular, like this one, right?
Okay,
so
yes.
there I was talking about the Dama de Elche, which was discovered in Alcudia, Spain, and it's an archaeological bust. And of course, there is a ritual connected to it, but nobody knows the details of it. The colors have seeped out of the stone because of the passing of time, and so has the original meaning. So I know it's very difficult to read the text as it is, but the sculpture also has these conch-like ears that go around both sides of her head, right? So those are a concrete representation of them. And it's a way of attempting to unbury the archaeology of the ritual. In other cases where you have Heshwi or Daphne, I was talking about the political assassination of Daphne Caruana Galizia. I took a text from Ovid in order to comment on a Maltese political situation. And it was interesting because it also came in translation, of course, translated to English, and it was translated to prose first, and then I used the poetic version. So it was a way of also uncovering a new story. And what I always say about this is, when I first attempted, and I started with the story of Daphne and Apollo, because of the similarity of the name and the idea of violation. Of course, Apollo wanted to rape Daphne, really. He always thought he was in love with those women, but he really wanted to rape them. So I said, how can I use this? And I started reading the text and crossing out most of it. What was left was horrifying and unsettling even to me, because it was already there. Everything was there. It was telling the story of the car bomb, basically, the fire, the body, how it dissipates, right? How it changes, the process of metamorphosis and death. So I found it to be a good vehicle in terms of writing politically without being too political, because I don't like being political with a capital P, and I like raising many questions. I ask more questions than I answer there. And of course, Daphne was not a saint, right? But the car bomb was wrong, and the assassination was all wrong, and the corruption behind it was unacceptable. So I thought that with this kind of text, I could bring these ambivalences to the surface, right? And for people who are not really interested in reading poetry, those things will never be clear anyway, especially those people who want to read politics only. So in a way, it's protective veil. With the other text, with the erasers, so for example, there's another one, the one I wrote in dactylic hexameters. It's about a friend who committed suicide. And in that case, I wrote the text, but then I kind of wanted to move away from the hexameters. Okay. Are you okay? then I wanted to move away from the hexameters, and just because I was writing about a person who always wanted me to write a poem about her, and at the time her story was not tragic. I had nothing to write, but when she committed suicide, unfortunately, many years passed, and then unfortunately I did have something to say, and I felt that I could only connect spiritually and perhaps in a less materialistic way by erasing my own words, right? And allowing the text to speak to me in another way, right? So yeah, writing in the margins, writing on the edges. It's also an act of resistance, bringing out what's being put aside. Blackout erasure is also a satiric attack on 17 Black, which was an offshore company, obviously. So there is also a lot of play. And I enjoy that process of play. I hope it doesn't put readers off, but it engages them more because they're seeing something different. So I think when you put a collection together, as Immanuel was saying, as Peter was saying, sometimes you get tired of your own style, and that happens to me too. So I bore easily as a human being, and therefore I'm always looking for new forms. So it's an evolution, and now my writing has become much more experimental, much more hybrid. And thank you for the question.
Well, thank you very much. I think it really is, in a way, it's more demanding, of course, for the reader, but then, of course, it also allows you to, to go more slowly and to piece together the connections, the links, and so on. So I think that, I don't know, any other comments or anything anybody would like to add?
Just to thank you, Nada, because you did so much work. Without you, of course, we would not have the translations and motifs, because you were translating them very successfully in English, right? And you were the first person to contact us. So I think it's important, especially for small countries, to be in contact and to translate one another.
Yes,
and thank you for all your work, and especially today. I know you're not feeling very well, but thank you for your effort, and your voice has held out. And thank you also to everybody, to Immanuel and to Peter. It was lovely speaking to all of you. Just I'm very grateful, that's all. And I hope people will enjoy this.
Well, thank you very much. Personally, I enjoyed very much this conversation as well. Hope the others did too. I'm just looking now. There are no.
Yes, I would like also to thank you, Nada, and me now working behind the scenes. Abigail, we live on the same island, but we never see each other. Some people think we're all the time bumping into each other, but it's not the case. And Peter, whom I haven't seen for a very long time, and hope to see you sometime again in Ljubljana, not here in Malta, in Ljubljana.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, Nada, and I enjoyed very much. Now I'm not in the contact with Maltese literature, writers, poets, as much as I was in contact years ago. So it was a really great time for me. So I hope we meet each other on Malta or in Slovenia or in some third country.
Yes, that's right. I also hope that. Well, actually, I've only been to Malta once, but that was really a great experience. So I was on the road all the time. Every morning after breakfast, I would just take a bus to Valletta, where this hub of bus lines is, and then ride off somewhere. I saw all those catacombs as well, and got lost for a while in the St. Paul's catacombs.
Scary.
And it was really a very enjoyable time. And I must also say that I was impressed when I was reading right now this novel, for example, Jutta Heim, and I really enjoyed it. And yes, there's still so much to see, to read, and possibly to translate. I would really like to keep in touch as well.
We've got an open invitation.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, and see you some other time.
Thank you to everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye.